as my little write-up says, I'm a retired professor of information systems. In the last few years, I've been working entirely in human research ethics. I've been the chair of Swinburne's HREC for 8 years, and before that, I was the chair of one of the HRECs at UTAS for 5 years, and I've been on committees all over the place. I'm also a reviewer with Bellbury. And I have a great interest in both data and in HRECs. So I thought I'd like to talk today. I'm just going to try and see if I can get this to work. I'm going to share my screen. I'll just try and hang on. That's not the way I want to do it. I want to do it from here. I'll share my screen and hope that it works. And here we go, I hope. Share. It does seem to be working. And we'll go down to here. And then I just have to swap these two screens over now. Swap. Okay, hopefully that's working all right for everybody. This is really, it's nothing like such an intellectual presentation as the ones we've had up till now. It's not nearly as glamorous. But really what I want to talk about is the issues that secondary data causes for HRECs, because as somebody who's been chairing an HREC now for 13 years, I've had so many people ask me questions, and the same questions keep coming up over and over and over again. So I thought I'd start with a little bit of background. This is a slide that I've been working on for quite a while. There's just so much data, and I keep adding to it. Every time I can't think of another type of data, I just add it to it. And, you know, there is data in every direction, and everybody wants to get access to it, and everybody wants to get ethics approval for it. And as we've heard already today, AI and virtual reality and all these other things, Internet of Things, blockchain, are not as straightforward to get ethics approval as you might think. So what is ethics secondary data? Well, it's data that was collected for some other purpose, essentially, other than the purpose you're asking for approval to use it for now. It's available for an awful lot of sites. And if you think about it, it used to come essentially from written sites, and now increasing that, court records, all that sort of thing, increasingly is electronic data. And one of the things an awful lot of people forget is existing research finding, including your own data, if it doesn't have approval. The sources can be publicly accessible. They can be accessible via registration. They can be data that seems to be public, and social media data causes so much angst for ethics applicants. Or it can be available because you actually have consent from participants to use it in the future. The thing about social media, and I get so many queries about this from applicants who say, oh, well, it's a public Facebook page, so I don't need to get ethics approval at all, do I? The truth is that people don't expect to suddenly find that the stuff they post on a social media site is going to make them a research participant. And this is really exactly the same thing about going out and observing people in a park or in a restaurant or in a museum. Those people, yes, they're out in public, and no, you don't have to fill in a form to look at them, but they don't expect to be research participants. And just as with physical world studies, there are potential risks for the people who are posting on social media arising from suddenly finding their data in a published research finding, particularly if it unmasks pseudonymous identities, or if that de-identification could have an impact in terms of that person's life, their work life, their social life, their legal rights, etc. And by the way, all the references I have here are actually to the new version of the national statement, which kicks in on the 1st of January, where the big changes are to Section 5 and also to Chapter 2.1. But they did something really sneaky. They took out one item in Chapter 3.1, which we all cite all the time. They took out item 14. So basically everything from 14 onwards has moved down an item. And I thought I'd just include this little table from a study that was actually done 5 years ago. But it's kind of interesting when they asked people at that time, how would you feel if a tweet of yours was used in a research study? And it's interesting, the thing that upset most people was their protected account. But if you look at the things that they dislike more, the dark blue colors, if it was quoted in published research and attributed to your Twitter handle, if the researchers also analyzed your public profile information, if it was a public tweet you had later deleted, if you weren't informed at all, that would make people either very or somewhat uncomfortable. That's actually coming up towards 66%. If it was analyzed along with only a few dozen tweets, So you can see it's not quite, it's fair, people are fairly comfortable if the researchers don't have any of their public profile, and there are no human researchers who read it, but it was analyzed by a computer program, or if it was analyzed along with millions of other tweets. But the things that upset people down here is essentially if the Twitter data, if your tweet was linked in with other things, they don't really want to be identified in research. And the national statement does talk about this, and they make it very clear in what is going to become 3.1.51, currently 3.1.52. The use of internet-based information will need to be considered in the context of the need for consent or a waiver of consent and the risks associated with the use of the information. So not only do you have to have consent either from the person who provided the data or from an ethics body acting on behalf of that person, but it also requires consideration of the risks. And that's really one of the things that comes up over and over again in all the ethics committees that I'm involved with, that people don't seem to understand that apparently publicly available information is not okay to use in research. So I thought I would pick up a couple of issues. If these are two things that have helped people, where there is no existing consent. So for example, data that was gathered for non-research purposes, for example, quite often in a university, people who are professional staff enroll in a doctorate later and then say, I've got this fantastic data from some work I did when I was a member of professional staff. I love to use it for my doctorate. Or investigators who would like to reuse data or tissue for new topics. So it was gathered for one purpose and now they want to use it for a new study. Or they have already gained consent from their participants for future use, but now they want to add a new type of analysis that might perhaps make the data a bit more identifiable, who knows. It is possible to do that. And that is that the participants must provide informed consent to that. And if the participants themselves are not available, then an ethics committee is in a position to look at that and say, yes, we can provide consent on behalf of the participants. The other one that is worth thinking about is using open data access. And if you have got consent to put your data into one of the many, many, many publicly available sites, such as open data, the policies that are mentioned by the NHMRC, ARC, ARDC, academic journals, increasingly they're requiring open data access. There is a movement towards that. Now that is absolutely wonderful, but it does open up problems if you have told your participants that only the researchers will see the data. And then you want to publish in a journal like PLOS or Emerald, and they say, no, we've got to be able to see your raw data. And you think, oh, that'll be fine. And then you don't stop to think, you come back to the ethics committee and say, that'll be okay, won't it? And we say, well, no, because you told your applicants that you would be the only people who ever saw it. So you're going to have to go back to them now and ask for consent for everybody to see the raw data, or you're going to have to put it in as a waiver. And in that situation, it's going to be pretty unlikely that you're going to get a waiver of consent if you told people one thing and now you want to do something different. So I came up with a few examples. Now I've tweaked these so that they're really not, they don't look anything like the ones I saw in the first instance. The first one was from somebody who said, I'd like to get advice seeking the use of ABS data. But this is not the general ABS data. This is a specific ABS data set. I'm not sure if I'm actually getting in your way. Let's move that over there. I'm preparing a manuscript using ABS health literacy data, which means it's a specially designated data set that the ABS has prepared for this group of researchers. The project has ethics approval and the cluster analysis results were approved for release by the ABS. Since it's a secondary analysis using de-identified data and no participant involvement, do I even need ethics approval at all? So what we said to them was, first of all, secondary data by definition never includes participant involvement. It's the use of data already collected for some other purpose. People do tend to forget about that. So the issue really comes back to, did the people whose data was originally collected give consent to the use of their data for future research? If they didn't, then this means that it doesn't comply with NS 3.1.51. The proposed access to or use of the data or information does not match the expectations of the individuals from whom the data was obtained or to whom it relates. So you're going to need a waiver of consent. The original researchers claim that the data de-identified does provide an acceptable answer. When you actually fill in your waiver, it does provide an acceptable answer to the first two questions. Why do you want, why do you need a waiver of consent, and how are you going to protect your participants? But you'll still need to answer 2.3.10d, which says, essentially, if you had been able to answer them, why do you believe that they would have been happy for you to do so? Now, that's the trickiest question of all in the 9 questions that 2.3.10 asks. And we have had people come back and answer that question by saying, no, there's no reason to think that they would have objected. I said, no, that's not enough. We need to know, excuse me, why you think they would not have objected if you'd asked them. So in other words, what reason would you be able to give them for why it's, what reason would they have given you for why it's okay? So in this particular case, I basically we went back to the person and said, no, you will need to apply for a waiver of consent. Not only would you need ethics approval, but you'll actually need to apply for a waiver of consent. And this is a really, really common question. I don't know how many of you watching have found this one coming up over and over and over again. The next one is completely different. This was a researcher who really knew what she was doing and was doing some very sophisticated graphical work. This person was in fact an architect and was doing some very sophisticated work. So the project was going to focus on a comparative evaluation of recent algorithms for object detection to determine and calibrate the most accurate available solution to describe spatial dynamics, describing mobility and pedestrian behavior in a public space in another country, a European country. The video frames will be recorded from street intersections in the city of X. They will be provided by the city council, and the researchers' tasks are purely going to focus on the analysis and data mining of the content of the images. The risks described by the researcher, who had covered absolutely everything, included potentially exposing individuals' identities. And following review the first time around, because it didn't go into enough detail, it was clarified that the risk would be managed by no storage of image data. The algorithms will only output text data. No image or video will be generated from the computational analysis. Instead, text files will be produced storing generic numerical data, referring to the detected classes, which were cars and motorbikes and things like that, and respective spatial positions in the frame. So the researchers essentially solved most of the problems. The first time we looked at it, it was quite tricky because the study is taking place in Australia. So the relevant ethics and data management guidelines had to be the Australian ones, not the European GDPR, which was cited in the first instance. And the GDPR has actually gone a lot further than we have to come up with some really, really good issues and identifying some really clear guidelines. Normally, this would require a waiver of consent for the use of the data because its use had not been consented to by the individuals. However, the techniques being used by the investigators, by basically turning it into textual data only, had made the data truly anonymous. So we went back to the national statement and found that in the introduction to Chapter 3.1, Element 4, risk may also arise where identifiers have been removed from the data or information replaced by a code, but where it remains possible to re-identify a specific individual. And that wasn't the case here. Due to technological advances, risks may arise in respect to data. So that did not occur. So we were able to simply approve it as it stood. Now, my third one is a completely generic issue. And I don't know how many of you have had this come up, but I have lost count of the number of people who've said to me, what's the difference between a waiver of consent and exemption from ethical review? Or they may not have phrased it as a question, but they have misunderstood it and have conflated the two together. And in fact, I've even had this asked by ethics reviewers. So, sorry, a little bit of background. Of course, the terms are completely different. The waiver is a waiver of the requirement for consent. So the ethics committee is acting on behalf of the participants and providing consent on their behalf. Exemption from review means that the study in question complies with the national statement or institutional criteria relating to risk, data, and anonymity or limited accessibility, and therefore the ethics committee doesn't need to get involved. Under the revised review approach that the National Statement 2023 is putting forward, the circumstances under which research studies can be exempted have been widened. This is much broader now than the former 5.1.22. Research which may be eligible for exemption now includes studies carrying a lower risk to participants or the community and which satisfied one or more of the conditions in the new section 5.1.17a to D. And I'm not going to go through it for you now. I'm sure your university and your hospital are talking about that in great detail. What we're seeing is that universities are varying widely in their response to these changes. From one university that I'm aware of has decided they're not going to be granting any exemptions at all. Another university is creating a formal exemption review process. And a third university, all of which I'm actually aware of, is taking a more informal approach where the ethics office is going to make the decision as to whether an application can be exempt and everything in between those. So the decision to grant or withhold an exemption, whereas before it had to comply with section 5.1.22, is now going to be an institutional decision. So the national statement, the NHMRC and the ARC and Universities of Australia have basically said, these are the guidelines, but it's up to the individual institution whether they're going to say, yes, you will go along with 5.1.17, or they're just going to say, no exemptions at all. And I have a question for you that I'm hoping you can answer for me, because I've only been speaking to universities. Will hospital ethics committees be likely to grant exemptions in the same way that universities are going to do? Or are they going to say, oh, this is all too hairy for us? So having done that, and because we've got now almost 15, well, we've got 12 minutes left, I am going to stop sharing, get out of here altogether, I hope. Out. There we go. And I'm going to actually throw this open to you and say, well, what are your experiences? What are the things that you think? What's been happening for you? I'll just have a quick look at the Q&A. What's the position regarding social media content used in news media articles? NB, not public comments on media coverage, thinking of comments from individual pages set to public that are used in media coverage of issues or events. Well, I'm open to argument, but I would say that social media is social media is social media. The fact that another organization is quoting it doesn't take away from the fact that 3.1.51 says that you have to have consent to quote it. I mean, if the newspaper gained consent to quote, then that's fine. If they're quoting without having gained consent, then I would have thought they were in a slightly dubious position, but then newspapers do tend to do that sort of thing. They prefer to gain, what is it, forgiveness rather than gaining permission. And we've got, okay, I've got one question from Kathy Cole saying, part of the problem is our own making in defining analysis of tweets as research. Well, Kathy, feel free to say more about that, because I'm not quite sure what you mean. Certainly the national statement does classify analysis of tweets as research, but maybe you're talking about the fire hose, in which case it's such an enormous body of data that probably the chances of identifying individual participants, users would be much lower, but I'll throw it open to you. Jason, I thought it might be really interesting to hear what you said next, because a lot of what you were talking about, I think, fits in with what I'm raising.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's, I mean, there's always been an ethical imperative, and I think there will be even with synthetic data. So this is where you have to be really careful. So when I say that the data is not real, or, you know, it's not real in the sense that it doesn't reflect an individual anymore. But it's based off of, you know, it has been generated. It hasn't been fully synthesized out of thin air, if you will, and nothing really is. And so I think it still requires protections. And I think review boards and others will struggle over the next little while as this becomes more prevalent to figure out how to actually deal with these things. And I think some researchers will likely want to start making decisions that they don't need ethics approval in order to use the data. But I think data custodians, to be honest, will probably stop that. They will require certain conditions for use, as they always have for the data, because I think they realize it still needs to be protected.
Gail, what do you think? I mean, some of this overlaps a little bit with your area, particularly where the data custodians come in.
Yeah, tricky spaces, hey. Look, again, we will sort of set the broad guardrails, but really for custodians to work out with the individual researcher or the organisation, you know, making the data request. And I guess what I would encourage, or that, you know, from my perspective, the main thing is those conversations are had and those issues are thought through. And it's then for where the parties land within that broad guidance. It's very interesting for me to hear the conversation, because it may be that this is an area where we can provide some guidance in the future around these kinds of issues. I do have a role in that space, as I mentioned before, but my inclination is to also try and simplify the space, not complicate it further for researchers and others, because there are places where this guidance is already offered. But hearing what are some of the challenges that are coming up, it helps me think about, well, is there a role we could play in providing guidance for people? And also, is there a role we can play in education around that as well? And I'm conscious that ARDC and NHMRC, you know, there are other organisations that play in this space too. So I guess we want to sort of support by making it simpler and easier and more consistent, not by complicating further.
Yeah, absolutely. We've got a couple of questions. One is, how will the issues of principles of Indigenous data sovereignty be considered in the waiver of consent processes? Still not reflecting true data ownership stewardship. I think we've got two separate issues here. One is the waiver of consent, and the other is the issue of Indigenous data, which is a very complex one. I guess what I would say is what most ethics committees are doing is having a member who is Aboriginal as an expert in the area, which I'm not, by the way, and ensuring that all applications that come their way are reviewed by that person, as well as other people who are data experts or experts in the topic of the research. And certainly, you know, on my own ethics committee, when we get a question that is a waiver of consent and it relates to Indigenous data, we wouldn't dream of reviewing it without having an expert, because otherwise we're just going to get ourselves into all sorts of messes. I'm not sure if that's really an answer to your question. Feel free to add a follow-up question. But sorry, I hope my rooster isn't making too much noise in the background. He's a noisy little creature. And then I think I have an answer to my question about hospital HREC. So I remember Louisa said, I'm a member of the hospital HREC, and we receive many low-risk applications for review seeking a waiver of consent to access data contained within the PMI for a research project de-identified. My question relates to whether this data is considered secondary data, and if so, should hospital patients be informed that medical or hospital data could be used for research purposes in the future, and should they consent for their data to be used for future research? Louise, do you want to join the conversation? Because I think you've packed an awful lot into one question, and I'd be interested to have you unpack it a bit before we try and answer it, if you're still here. She is. Join the conversation, Louise.
Sorry, thanks. Well, really, it is just that we do receive a lot of requests, you know, to waive a consent for hospital data research to be conducted on hospital PMI data, largely on the premise that it is either too old to try and contact past patients to seek consent, or that it's a reasonably low risk premise that the research and will not harm the participant, but they are increasing because medical students and others need to undertake research, usually as a core subject, and the hospital data is constantly being accessed to conduct research. And so my question is really whether or not patients should be aware that when they are, you know, in a hospital for a medical procedure, that in future, sometime in the future, their data may be used for these types of research projects. And should there be at least some recognition that that could happen? And would they, you know, would patients like to give consent at that point? Because, you know, I agree it is very difficult. You can't go back and contact patients if you're doing a retrospective research project on retrospective data.
Great, thanks, Jason. I think you're going to answer this first.
Well, I don't know if I'm going to answer it. I'm probably going to muddy the waters more, Paula, and I apologize
You
I guess
go.
for that up front. But, you know, I think it's the term consent. So when I see that in this context, I think informed consent, because that's actually what's legislated. And so I actually don't think it's possible to actually ask participants in advance for consent, because there's no way that it could be informed. Because part of that informed consent in my mind is the idea as a research participant, you understand how your data will be used and what questions it may be used to answer. And so the idea of blanket consent to me is actually a misnomer. I don't think it exists. I don't think anyone should ever have it, because I don't think it exists. It's a nebulous concept to me, and I have serious problems with that. And you know, there are ethics committees obviously that I have seen provide that in various contexts. But for me, it's really around informed consent. And as a consumer myself and as a researcher, I think that that's really, you know, the legislation and the guidance on that has been written for that purpose. And I think that we drift away from that a little bit. So I guess my question is when you say consent, Louise, do you mean informed consent?
Well, I guess I'm concerned that, I mean, we know that this research is undertaken regularly in hospitals, that patient data is used. And maybe it's not informed consent, or maybe there should be a statement that people can opt out. If they don't want their data being used in any way, shape or form in the future, they can say, you know, I don't want that done. I mean, I'm assuming most people wouldn't mind, but I guess I'm just concerned that, to me, it's a loophole, because it's very easy to present an argument that it's unreasonable to try and seek consent when you've got historical data that you want to access. It's like a self-perpetuating cycle, to be honest. So I don't know what the answer is. I was just asking the question.
Yeah.
No, I think it's a good question. I mean, it's certainly true, you know, when you go into a hospital, they make you sign all sorts of consent. But interestingly, my husband was going to go to a firm of allergists, a medical practice of allergists, for some tests, and they wanted him to fill in this form, which basically gave them totally uncontrolled use of his data in any form they wanted into the foreseeable future. He just said, no, thanks, forget it. I'm not going to have anything to do with you. He's a software engineer, and he was fairly appalled when he saw it and thought, really, what makes them think they have the right to do this? But I gather it's quite increasingly popular. So there's certainly, yes, exactly. I couldn't agree more, Alison. Completely coerced consent is not consent. I mean, it depends on what you're doing. You know, when you're going to have surgery and they make you sign a thing that says, while you're under the anesthetic, if we discover something horrible, we reserve the right to do surgery and fix it. That's one thing. But it's another matter entirely for people to take blanket control away from you. Now, we've got a whole lot of questions coming up all over the place, actually. So although Jason makes a great point, re-informed consent when requesting unspecified consent, our HREC requests this to be an opt-in option with the caveat that all research will use this data must have ethics approval. Jason, over to you.
Yeah, so I think there are ways to think about this. I think this also bumps up against what I call social license. And I actually also think that it's different depending on whether you're in a public or a private hospital, right? So I think there is a public good. And, you know, I know Gail spoke quite eloquently about that at the beginning of her talk, and really why her entity exists, if you will, is because that data is collected as a public good. And so I think when you're in a public healthcare system, similar to each state in Australia, I think there is this idea of a public good, and that data being used to drive innovation and constant improvement in the system, I think needs to be understood and needs to have, there is some implied license there, if you will, social license. But, you know, I think it's difficult, and I think there's lots of ways to do it. I mean, most of the work I've done for my entire career has been under waivers of consent. And I was a little horrified, Paula, at your one example where someone was, you know, where people were wondering the difference between a waiver of consent and basically exemption. And I was like, it just blows my mind. Because I think through this a lot in terms of, and I think it's a real privilege for me as a researcher to be able to use this data. And so I think a lot about it and how it will be protected. And I believe in the concepts of privacy by design. So it's really is thinking through those aspects. And I think, you know, the legislation, I think, has the ability for an ethics committee to make that decision and provide the waiver of consent. And so I think that's the avenue that is better to me than setting up a false dichotomy of saying, well, these people consented. And it's like, well, but what have they consented to? Did they actually understand? And I think, as you can see, as you start to unpack that a little bit, you can see that they probably won't meet the bar for the legislation for consent. And so I think then you are left with the other part of the legislation, which is to ask for a waiver, where the ethics committee then makes that decision on behalf of those participants, you know, within the constraints of the information and what it is that's being done. So this is where I think it gets a little bit difficult, and it's you know, but I think the other thing too is that ethics is a living thing, which I think most people don't probably think about either. They think of it as a box ticking exercise. And, you know, a study I did 15 years ago may or may not get approved today, because I think there actually are changes in the way that people think about these things. And so I think that's one of the things that as researchers, we have to be cognizant of. So we have to understand that you know, we have to give it thought now for the study that we're doing, not the fact that I did a study 5 years ago and it was approved doesn't mean that this one will get approved. So it's about thinking through how that changes. And I think, as I said, social license is related to that, because that actually does change over time. Yeah.
Fiona has said that at her hospital in the cancer clinic, they have an opt-out notice at the front desk. So if you don't want your, if you don't want your data to be used, you can say so. They've got so many comments coming in, they're flooding in now. Here we go. You have to fill out a form. Now, look, that would be great if you could do it, but it's quite interesting because I was involved in reviewing some applications where people wanted to use GP data. And there's a system where GP's data is all being collected and going to a body who put it into a gigantic data set, and it's available for medical researchers. And they say, oh, you know, patients can opt out. Well, I have to tell you that no practice I have gone to have I ever seen the opt-out form, ever. I haven't ever seen a brochure on the wall. And believe me, I look, because I'm so paranoid about data, you wouldn't believe. I go looking for the blasted forms, and I have never seen one anywhere saying, if you would like to opt out of having your data used, just go up to the front desk and say to the receptionist, will you please opt me out? Because believe me, if I could, I'd be front and center. Opt me out, please. And so I think there's an awful lot of medical data floating around that patients would be really horrified if they knew about. I'm very relieved, Fiona, to know that your hospital at least gives people a chance to opt out. Okay, so there's lots, and we're getting masses and masses of comments, but we're already 5 minutes past. Thanks, Gary. Okay, I think we should probably stop at this stage because we could go on all afternoon, but people need a break. I need some lunch, and there's another session coming up soon. So I'd just like to thank Jason and Gail for some fascinating presentations, which obviously by the number of questions really got people thinking. And also to thank Sarah for being such a star and putting everything together and looking after us so well. And thanks, Gordon. See you all later. Bye for now.